Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. This is kind of our part two of Franklin Roosevelt. In our last episode, we talked about some campaign speeches, some party platforms, and Roosevelt's first inaugural address. And we have Professor Weinberg back with us. And today we're going to talk about the fireside chats as a means of communication. And then also, again, some laws that were passed, some things that kind of happened. So Professor Weinberg, FDR is really the first president to kind of utilize the radio in this manner of fireside chats. Is that correct?
I mean, Coolidge is the first one that's really doing anything with radio, but he's not. He doesn't have much to communicate, and he doesn't view himself. His understanding of constitutional power generally, both for the federal government and for the executive, is not sort of. It's not the sort of centerpiece of American society, and particularly in the Depression. Again, and this is a theme that we talked about in the last podcast, that as much as anything, Roosevelt views his role as avoiding the demoralization that he also fears will end up with a radical like Huey Long, who's going to be a subject of another podcast, right? So he's basically trying to, this is a theme he keeps alluding to. We don't want to have radicalism, which he then will say, and I'm not the radical. I'm the not radical solution. Stop the radicals. His critics will obviously say he's not that much different than Huey Long or whatever, but and so he really does during the Depression basically try to lay out things that the administration is working on, just to sort of convey to Americans a sense that's important to him that they have, that sort of the government is looking out for them. And so he undertakes these for years, and he is really quite a good orator on that front. If you listen to those speeches, right, he doesn't have the sort of like he doesn't have, compared to like Huey Long, generally speaking. Now, Roosevelt can do some demagoguery. I'll say a word about that later, but it really more is generally an effort to be kind of reassuring during this time of challenge. You could almost compare it to like preaching, kind of like pastor preaching kind of thing, as much as sort of policy stuff, but some of that too.
Him speaking, because he's in these addresses, he's speaking to the general public, right? Is this a way to kind of assuage fears of what is going on?
It is that. I mean, it's got very heavy emphasis on that. There is an element of political job owning to it, which is that he's got a captive audience in a way that, this is something that we talked about before, that Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt had anticipated, that the idea would be that the centralization of media would massively empower the president. But, he's not the only one that can get on the radio, but, Huey Long gives radio addresses and other people can give a radio address, but are the stations going to cover it? Or, are they going to give him the airtime in that sense, right? So, again, it's part of, just broadly speaking, also the consolidation of, you can argue it's power, but the consolidation of certainly interest in the presidency is, I think, a clear consequence of these as well, that the presidency ceases to be sort of the administrator of a government far away and a sort of omnipresent figure, right? So there's a fairly short line, I think, between that and, presidential tweets, so to speak. Not quite the same in method, but the sort of the idea that you're just like always hearing from the president is something that really comes out of FDR.
And I think, again, we're not going to go into detail on some of these, but in one of the first ones he does on the banking crisis, he uses it to educate people on like what banks do, right? He's talking about when you put money in the bank, they don't just put it in a vault and hold it. They're investing it and they're doing all of these things. And then talked about what happened. And it seems he just, it's this very educational thing, because this is one of his first ones is on March 12th, which is pretty quickly after his first inaugural address.
When they're trying to do the bank, when they're doing the bank holiday and the bank reforms. So, I mean, that's arguably his first sort of major policy piece of the first New Deal. Yeah, that's right.
Yes, he talks about that. And then in May, talking about the New Deal programs, where he's, talking about what he's going to do about this. Again, they're interesting speeches to listen to, but also to read. So one of the things that he does in his presidency is, and this I noticed was in the 1932 Democratic Party platform, was the Social Security Act.
Although it's supposed to be at the state level in the platform.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because all states are doing old age pensions. And he says effectively, we encourage the states to do those kinds of things, but it explicitly is not a federal. It's not federal.
So how does this then change to 1935 with the Social Security Act?
Yeah. So and that sort of indicates one of the things that we tend to think of a New Deal, but there's really two. So the first New Deal really is much more of sort of dealing with temporary, basically. He's not a Keynesian, and obviously, like a Keynesian would say, you raise spending during you spend countercyclically. I know we're doing one of my colleagues is doing another podcast on Keynesianism, but we flatten Keynesianism to be just government should spend more and regulate more. But Keynesianism is actually a theory of countercyclical stuff, that you're supposed to actually aggressively cut government spending in surplus and peace years, and raise spending to raise demand. Right? It's supposed to be counter to demand, and that's not how it gets interpreted. So Roosevelt himself is not an orthodox Keynesian. Some of his people end up picking it up. But the first New Deal really is more of a focus on stabilizing the banking system, dealing with concerns about, over investment in the sense of lending out too much money that then you get liquidity crunches and such. He does want to have purchasing of ag surpluses. But the first New Deal, and then there's the National Recovery Act, which will get struck down by the court as exceeding federal power. We had a whole podcast on Schechter, so I don't want to go into that. But that's the other centerpiece of the first New Deal, is basically the president creating all these regulatory codes. And the court strikes it down on both federalism and separation of powers grounds. So you should go back and listen to that one in greater detail. So as that first batch of things, again, he has almost overwhelming control of Congress. He can get pretty much whatever he asks for. And so he starts thinking about whether this should be a moment not to deal with temporary problems of, the Depression, but whether basically this can be a moment to have the federal government create a broader regime of sort of economic stabilization and security, economic security in the sense of, dealing with or creating basically backstops that are individual based, right? Again, this is different than the first New Deal, which is much more about, supply demand kinds of things. And again, this had been something that on the actual policy level, the states had been experimenting with and good with, building old age pensions, building unemployment programs. So the existence of these in and of themselves is not that incredibly controversial. The controversial move is that Roosevelt wants to move this to the federal government, which is in tension with orthodox understandings of constitutionalism. Again, the ones that he himself was saying, as we talked about in the last podcast 3 years ago, right? The fascinating thing, we plunking down 1930 Franklin Roosevelt with 1933 Franklin Roosevelt and having them converse. So yeah, he moves to create the Social Security program, which in and of itself, and originally the first version of that, it's since changed over time, does have a greater role for the states. So the states are sort of running it more directly with sort of federal conditions. Now, even the states that have had the most robust programs, this is something that the Supreme Court justices will discuss. Basically, none of the state programs are considered acceptable to the federal government. And so this is an argument that they make, saying, look, this isn't just like giving money to the states. This is like actually directly regulating the way that they're going to run it. And if you look at the adoption of Social Security, so they passed it in 1935, the uptake of the states is quite interesting. We don't have too many resources in terms of the state legislative records, but they're pretty wild if you go back and read them. There's a lot of them will effectively say, we think this is grossly unconstitutional. We expect the Supreme Court to strike it down. But until they do, we want that money coming to our states. There's one quote, I'm trying to remember whether this one's from Indiana or Maine. Those are the two states we have the best records for. But he says, voting to have my state participate in this is the most hateful thing I've ever done in my career and a violation of my oath to God and country. But like, I guess I have to do it anyway. So they really are expecting the Supreme Court to strike it down because it is such a massive expansion into sort of, health and welfare, which were traditionally, under the orthodox sort of Madisonian understanding of the Constitution, like things that the states could do, things that progressives had said the states should do. But to expand that up to the federal level is quite striking. But again, that's the sort of the core of the welfare state and regulations that the second New Deal is. And this is partly why in 1936, most of the 1920s Democratic leadership, including Al Smith, they're opposed to Roosevelt because they basically say you have betrayed the things that you seemingly ran on by now having the federal government. You are not cutting. Social Security does not result in a 25% cut in federal spending, shall we say. And so much of the Democratic leadership actually ends up either explicitly backing the Republicans or backing kind of anti-FDR Democrats. And Roosevelt will have none of this. He'll try to purge them electorally in 1938 from senators that are skeptical of it. But this is another speech that is one that I think almost nobody knows about. I was thinking about it recently when Trump gave a pre-election speech in Madison Square Garden, and people said, this is like the craziest speech ever given before an election. And Roosevelt actually gives a speech a couple days before the election in Madison Square Garden. And he says, critics of Social Security, quote, are aliens to the spirit of American democracy. This is, again, a year after it passes. But he says, anyone who's criticizing it is already an alien to the spirit of American democracy. Let them emigrate and try their lot under some foreign flag in which they have more confidence. That is not any shortage of confidence for FDR while the Supreme Court is considering something that is certainly inconsistent with what he thought a few years ago, but to say, if you don't buy into my policy, you're un-American, leave the United States. So, Roosevelt, and is alluded to before, he's talking about economic royalists. So he is not taking criticism lightly, even though he's making rather draconian changes, to the structure of American government. So the second New Deal has a lot more pieces like that. The Supreme Court eventually approves them all. Well, not all of them, but pretty much all of the second New Deal clears. It's where we get also the Wickard case that we've talked about in federalism. So we can go hear that one again. But he basically he initially tries to push through court packing, which is arguably his greatest failure, because even many of the Democrats who have been backing him, he's steadily expanded federal power against what a lot of their own preferences were, frankly. There's a great line. I want to say it's his vice president saying, boys, here's where I cash in my chips. That I was willing to do a lot to defend federal power and defend the expansion of federal power, but I can't do this. Because Roosevelt his advisors had said, why don't you get specific constitutional amendments authorizing expansion regulations of hours and wages, right? Regulating, authorizing the federal government to run unemployment, like specific ad enumerated powers. Like, we have total control of Congress. We have total control of the state governments. Like, we don't need to do this. And Roosevelt just thought it was easier to just basically browbeat the court. And then when they didn't get browbeaten, he thought it was easier to add more justices. And then it turns out the one neat trick was you just started bribing them to retire with generous retirement pensions, such that by 1942, as we talked about with Wickard, the Supreme Court is basically willing to say anything the federal government wants to do that doesn't break the Bill of Rights is okay. So Roosevelt is, so then there's the question of like, does this work, right? Did the New Deal work? And that depends on what your metrics are. In terms of fighting the Depression, Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, in 1939 says, unemployment is just as bad as it was when we started. We've spent all this money. We've built all these programs. It doesn't seem like it's done anything. So in terms of that metric, and there are some generally more conservative historians that argue that the Roosevelt administration made it worse by having government sort of interfere with what would have been the recovery, above my pay grade. But just on sort of metrics of employment and whatnot, it doesn't seem like it succeeded in certainly the hope that they thought it would. Now, conversely, if you're thinking sort of the longer term policy outcomes of it's better to have a society with guaranteed protections on unemployment and old age, et cetera, that they're federally administered, obviously those endure. So that certainly sticks, even as a lot of the kind of first New Deal, specifically depression fighting pieces, either fell away, were found to be ineffective. So the second New Deal is certainly much more enduring. So, yeah.
So really quick question about court packing. So the president cannot change just like willy-nilly, be like, I'm going to add more. The Constitution, Article 3 does not say anything about how many justices.
It says there has to be at least one. You have to have a chief justice. Beyond that, it is up to the discretion of Congress. That's right. So it's not violating, and the numbers have been tweaked over time. So court packing in and of itself, so adding justices does not in and of itself violate the Constitution. But the argument is adding justices to then have the justices sign off on what are other violations of the Constitution. Hoover and other people are losing their minds about this. I said Hoover was kind of moderately progressive when he was president. Court packing, et cetera, makes him lose his mind and sound like basically all the caricatures of him. Paranoid about the federal government, paranoid about presidential overreach, et cetera. So they actually have most of the prominent opponents of court packing are most of the Democratic senators who had been many of his allies. Some of them are still, Hugo Black is one of the folks. This is partly why Hugo Black ends up with a court nomination, is because Hugo Black was willing to go down with the ship defending that proposal. So, there is the narrative that the court switches its jurisprudence because of court packing. I don't think that's accurate. I think they switch for very, very, very technical reasons. And then largely Charles Evans Hughes, the Chief Justice, just sort of throws his hands up in the air. He throws his hands up in the air, but then the others, just once they start losing, they just all retire quickly. So Roosevelt gets to replace pretty much the whole Supreme Court. So quite quickly, including the one that amuses me the most, that he ends up appointing as Chief Justice the only person Calvin Coolidge put on the Supreme Court, which there's a fun thing I read from the person who probably would have gotten the Supreme Court nomination instead if he'd accepted it. Coolidge tried to get him to take it, and he lamented and said, basically, like, I turned it down because I needed money to pay for like my 6 daughters' education or whatever it is. I needed to go work in the private sector, but it's this the way he writes it is really funny. The guy's name's Nathan Miller from New York, but he says, like, had I known from there, Harlan Stone was appointed and we saw all that happened afterwards, something. It's like this very laconic lament that he wishes he'd taken it. But yeah, so I will note that I think Roosevelt is someone who, I mean, you've probably gathered 30 years ago, Woodrow Wilson was usually considered like a top 10 president and has dropped, basically Wilson getting hammered from both left and right. The left largely for his sympathies with, segregation, violations of civil liberties, although you get that from like the First Amendment stuff from the right as well. And the right for the critiques on constitutionalism, federalism, separation of powers. I do see I wouldn't be completely shocked. When I was in grad school, I definitely noticed that there was a lot more scholarship going after Roosevelt from both the left and the right as well. So it would not completely shock me if, the critiques. Korematsu is going to be another podcast you folks will do. That is, as that has become sort of more salient, that has harmed his reputation. I mean, if even J. Edgar Hoover, who was willing to wiretap Barry Goldwater for LBJ, says it's too much, which he was against that, right? So Korematsu and internment has hurt his reputation. Basically having this, convincing the Senate to go after his critics in terms of like trying to sort of financially ruin them for criticizing him. Probably tough on the First Amendment. Some progressives have argued, redlining was implemented through the Roosevelt administration. His closest ally for a long time was Jimmy Burns, who was the chief opponent of Brown v. Board. So you've got sort of the left turning against him in a way that much of the right had been sort of hostile to the living constitutionalism, federalism, separation of powers, and court packing. So I wouldn't be completely shocked because he usually polls in like the top 3 or 4. I wouldn't be completely shocked if those historiographical tendencies sort of pull him down along with Wilson. Maybe they reverse. I don't know, but that's definitely been a tendency where FDR was. I mean, my understanding is like FDR was dang near a saint, where people would have him up in like pictures in their houses. I don't think that the historians will be doing that. Again, this is sort of weird left-right combo.
It's interesting because court packing came up in the 2020 election. I think that it was one of the, and I remember having to explain to people, like, the president can't just appoint Supreme Court justice. Right. Like, that's not a thing that they just, again, willy-nilly do. But because it comes up, and I mean, I think that then this is like a question for another podcast, is how long do you wait before you judge a president, right? Because like FDR, I remember learning about him in school, and it was always, so positive whenever. But as we go on, it just, the more you learn and the more you understand about it, the more criticisms I think come up.
Right. I mean, there's some that come back that, get reversed. Like Grant has moved up, as we've talked about. Grant was for a long time largely by the lost causers regarded as a drunk, a buffoon, a butcher, and an idiot. And he has sort of moved up. So, I mean, part of that is going to be a question of sort of what your emphases are, right? So if your emphasis is on sort of economics and class issues, then FDR looks a lot more appealing. If, progressives, if they're more interested in sort of identity or racial issues, FDR doesn't look so hot. And you could say that's the same critique of, Wilson. I'll just sort of back up for a second. So, part of what changes really is basically what people are emphasizing, what they think is most important, right? So, if your emphasis is on sort of class and concerns about economics, if you're on the left, FDR is more appealing. If you're on the left and issues of identity or race or equal protection matter more, right? FDR is going to look like, if you think that's the most important part of, say, being a good progressive, then FDR is going to drop. And you can, work the same thing with conservatives, even internally with a group sort of assessing its own members, what they're going to emphasize as well. So yeah, there's been some fun shifts over time. The weird one to me has been, I was told recently that like young people on Twitter have decided they liked George W. Bush, which, having seen the end of the George W. Bush presidency and those approval ratings, not commenting on whether it's justified or unjustified on either side of them, but that was a reassessment that was quite odd to me to see that little, I don't know if it was like they were looking at his paintings, or I don't imagine that it was a consequence of like, let's have a thoughtful reassessment of the possible Social Security modifications and No Child Left Behind and all that. But yeah, stuff can go in weird places.
It's probably because he was passing Michelle Obama candy. Like, I wonder if part of that is the relationship between, because, and he has had it like their funeral buddies, unfortunately, because the way that they sit, he sits next to Michelle, and again, different political parties. And it's interesting you brought up his paintings too, because there was a show at the Arizona Historical Society. And of course I went to it because but it's so interesting. So it makes me wonder if they're talking about like his post-presidency, right? And that kind of, again, this is, now I have another rabbit hole to go down of like, what makes a good president? And who I should ask too is Dr. Nod, because he has absolutely done this kind of stuff. So, okay.
Well, contemporary presidents are way outside my historical expertise. So I merely pointed it out, sort of how history can shift on that. But yeah, and there's also an element that I'll close on this, but there is an element of sort of there can be, I said, there can be an element of like ingratitude of like, well, what'd you do for me lately? Right. Of like,
Yes.
somebody was very effective at solving problems. Again, I'm not commenting on any individual president or anything like that, but solve the essential problems. And then you decide that those problems aren't important anymore, largely because that person solved them. And then you complain about the stuff that person did. So that is a tendency that that does make me kind of wince as historians sort of reassess people sometimes. But anyway, we've had lots of podcasts, and folks will have lots of folks that they can think about and assess.
Yes, Dr. Weinberg, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.